My paranormal experience on the Mexicali highway. Hello to everyone who comes across this story. I know it's very hard to believe, and honestly, I would doubt it myself if someone else were telling me. Even now, I still can't fully understand what happened. I'm from Mexicali, a city where I lived my entire life until I turned 18 and started attending the Autonomous University of Baja, California in Tijuana. At first, I would visit my family in Mexicali every now and then, traveling by bus. But halfway through my college years, I managed to save enough to buy a car, and that's when I started visiting them almost every weekend without fail. By then, I had already heard stories about La Rumorosa. People talked about how dangerous it was to drive through that area, about all the accidents that happened there, and also about the strange things that some claimed to have witnessed. I remembered one particular story my mom used to tell us when we were kids. It was about her parents, my grandparents, on a trip from Mexicali to Tijuana. They were driving on the stretch of road through the Laguna Salada, just before the climb up to La Rumorosa. That part of the highway runs straight through the desert. It was early morning and my grandfather was the only one awake. My grandmother and a couple of my aunts, who were children at the time, were asleep in the back seat. Suddenly, my grandfather saw a woman standing by the side of the road, as if she were hitchhiking. He pulled over about 100 meters ahead and woke up my grandmother. Together, they got out of the car to see if the young woman needed help. But when they looked around, she was gone. There was no sign of her. Almost immediately, they thought they heard a faint wailing carried by the wind, a hot, loud, and eerie wind that's all too familiar to anyone from Mexicali, especially in the Laguna Salada area. They got back into the car and continued driving, trying to convince themselves that maybe my grandfather had imagined her because he was so tired. At that point, my aunts, who were in the back seat, woke up. My grandmother started explaining why they had stopped. My grandfather, meanwhile, glanced back briefly to add something to the explanation. That's when he noticed the expression on one of my aunt's faces change. Her eyes widened in pure terror, as if they were about to pop out of her head. My grandfather immediately turned his gaze back to the road, and that's when he saw her. The woman was now sitting on the hood of the car, grinning directly at the 4 passengers inside. That chilling image stayed with me every time I passed through that area. Years later, during one of my trips back home to visit my family, I couldn't stop thinking about that story. It was a Friday evening, and I had just spent time with my girlfriend after school. As we said goodbye, I told her the story, and she listened intently. Before I left, she told me to drive carefully and kissed me. For some reason, that kiss felt like it might be the last one we'd ever share. I left Tijuana around 9 p.m. Before it was even 10, I was passing through Tecate, a charming little city I've always liked. Normally, I would stop to grab some bread or coffee, but this time, I decided to keep driving. Glancing at the car's clock, I noticed it was almost 10:40 p.m. when I started entering the area around La Rumorosa. This part of the road is eerie. Every 2 or 3 kilometers, you pass by an abandoned ranch or shack, but aside from that, it's completely deserted. Out of nowhere, I heard a deafening noise, like the blaring horn of a massive semi-truck right behind me. At the same time, bright lights suddenly blinded me. These lights didn't just come from behind me, they seemed to surround me, coming from every direction. I was so disoriented by the glare that I couldn't figure out where they were actually coming from. Then, just as abruptly as the noise had started, it stopped, and the lights vanished. My hands were trembling, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I desperately searched for a safe spot to pull over and compose myself. Before I could stop, the lights reappeared. This time, I felt a crushing sense of dread. I was convinced that at any moment, I'd either crash into something or veer off the road entirely. I could hear distant sounds, like the rumble of trucks growing louder and closer, but I couldn't see a thing through the blinding light that filled my truck's cabin. When the noise and lights felt like they were about to collide with me, instinct took over. I yanked the steering wheel sharply, swerving off the road. In that split second, I thought my chances of surviving were better if I ended up in a ditch or tangled in some bushes than if I collided head-on with whatever was coming toward me. I felt the car's tires leave the asphalt and hit rough terrain. Still, I couldn't see anything. It was like I was driving blind. I finally slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a full stop after a few more meters. The noise grew louder, now almost deafening, like a truck bearing down right on top of me. I shut my eyes tight, gripping the wheel as if it was my lifeline, and started thinking about my family, my girlfriend, and how much I longed to hear this story retold as just another strange roadside tale. And then, everything went silent. Even with my eyes still closed, I could sense that the lights were gone. Slowly, I opened them and looked around. It took a few seconds for my vision to adjust to the overwhelming darkness that now surrounded me. I couldn't recognize where I was. There were no bushes, no pine trees, nothing but sand, stretching out in every direction. It didn't hit me immediately how odd it was to see nothing but sand in a place like La Rumorosa, where vegetation is sparse but present. As I tried to gather my bearings, I thought I saw faint silhouettes in the distance, about 20 meters away. They were tall and slender, moving in the darkness. At first, I told myself they were just shadows, but the figures seemed to be getting closer. Panic overtook me, and I scrambled back into the truck, starting the engine and speeding back toward the road. What happened next is impossible to explain. One moment, I was certain I was still near La Rumorosa. The next, I realized I was already in the Laguna Salada, almost at the outskirts of Mexicali. Somehow, I had skipped the entire treacherous descent, those winding, dangerous curves on La Rumorosa's road, and found myself miles and miles away, in a place that should have taken an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, to reach. It all felt like it had happened in mere seconds. The confusion was overwhelming. I felt nauseous, my stomach burned, and it was hard to breathe. Eventually, I reached a populated area and spotted the warm glow of a small store, the first real light I'd seen since those mysterious, blinding ones. Inside, there was an older woman behind the counter. She must have noticed how shaken I looked because she immediately asked if I was okay. I could barely respond, managing only to ask for water before collapsing onto the floor. My legs gave out beneath me, and I was overcome with an intense urge to cry, maybe out of relief at finally seeing a kind face. The woman called out to a young man, asking him to prepare some tea for me. I didn't dare explain what had happened. She didn't ask for details, but before I left, she did warn me, no one should travel that road alone at that hour of the night. I glanced at the clock. It was past 3 a.m. Somehow, 5 hours had passed, though for me, it felt like only a few minutes. When I returned to my truck, I saw that my phone was flooded with missed calls and frantic messages from my parents, my girlfriend, and my friends. To this day, I have no idea how I managed to travel hundreds of kilometers in seconds or how those few moments turned into 5 hours. I've shared this story with very few people. Honestly, I don't expect anyone to believe me. The ones I've told are the ones I trust won't think I'm crazy. Nothing strange has happened to me since that night. No changes in my life, no lingering effects, except that I've sworn never to drive alone through La Rumorosa again, especially not at night. I avoid even looking toward that small store when I pass through now, though I wish I could thank the woman for what she did. But the thought of reliving that night is too much. You can't imagine how hard it is to go through something like this. I hope no one else ever experiences it. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Thank you for reading.